Everybody, this is Dr. John Tures, and I'm attempting to do a little barbecuing in between my UN presentations about the institutions. As you can see, I have put all the charcoal into the grill. I'm going to see if this is match lit or not. It claims it is, but I've had places claim that, and they turn out to not be the case. If not, I've got some lighter fluid I'm gonna administer. Let's see. Well, one of them seems to be going. But I don't think this is gonna go very well. Now it's starting to spread some. Got a little bit of a flame there. Don't want to start blowing on it just yet, but might be living up to expectations. I need a little bit to support. Think I need another match or so here. All right, slowly making its way. All right, see if I can't get a little more out of it. It's just two of these lit so far. Might try and catch some of the others on the side, but not be in a dangerous way. There we go. Not too much, just enough to help it along some. And now it's starting to move toward something we can work with. It's going to take a while for it to get pretty hot. You can hear all that cheeping in the background. That is, we got some birds in our carport. And Mama Bird has just come back to feed them. It's right over here. Babies are hungry, kind of like my own. And so while we're moving along here, I thought I'd use that as like a little metaphor to talk about the UN and as things start moving along. We're on the UN institution slide. We've moved on to slide 13. And in this, if you think about it, it started pretty small, having these world courts. We began with a world court, which was like a list of arbiters, neutral judges who could hear cases, and that started in The Hague. And then they moved to the League of Nations and their permanent International Court of Justice, which wasn't so permanent because the League didn't last more than 2 decades. But the world powers decided that they did need they still needed an international court to handle disputes. They just, with a better UN, perhaps an international court of justice might work out. So like the other places, it's based in The Hague in the Netherlands. You have 15 elected judges, and they serve a 9-year term, so they don't always have to worry about looking over their shoulder based on every little decision. Just like UN peacekeeping, that both parties have to agree to have the court hear their case. And unlike some other institutions, only states can be parties to a case. It's not like our Supreme Court where individuals can be a party, or you can have states versus state, individuals versus the federal government, and so on and so forth. Only countries can bring these disputes forward. Like there's one about, it's called Los Bolsones, and these are little pockets that are disputed between El Salvador and Honduras, as well as an island, I think it's called Isla Tigre, in the Golfo de Fonseca, which is a water area near them. And both El Salvador and Honduras disagreed about their border and who controlled these little pockets of dispute, who was really in charge of the Gulf of Fonseca. And so both countries had to agree that they would take their case to the International Court of Justice that would be hearing their dispute. This took a long time. In fact, they actually fought a war between each other over these areas. Now, that was the underlying cause for the war. The actual cause, believe it or not, strangely enough, was football, or what we call soccer in the U.S., where El Salvador and Honduras, they had to play each other in an elimination match. Who was going to go to the World Cup? And the Honduran fans were tough on the El Salvador team. Uh, and the same thing El Salvador did unto Honduras, and just the anger that built up over them led to a war. It's actually called the Football War. It was thankfully not a very bloody war. Still, more than 2,000 people died in the fighting along the border, but it did not last very long. I actually got to share a plane ride with someone who is at the border as a Peace Corps worker. And just as the troops started shooting at each other, he was moved out of that area. But the dispute went on for a long time, and I believe El Salvador picked up some territory when the International Court of Justice issued their rulings, although they still had to work out some details as to where the border markers would go. They'll have a majority issue an opinion. The minority within the case is permitted to issue a dissenting opinion, but there's no appeal beyond the International Court of Justice. Now, sometimes, you remember that Venn diagram I showed you a while ago? There can be an advisory opinion given in cases involving Italy and Finland, where they will tell the countries, like, okay, if we were to rule, here's how we're thinking. And on that Venn diagram, you saw that advisory role was one of the things the International Court of Justice can do. Hang on a sec, I got to blow. Doesn't seem to be going as much as I thought it would. Well, I may have blown it a little too hard. At least the coals are starting to get white and a little hot, but they're just not spread out as much. I'm going to have to strike another match. See if that can't go in and cause a little flare up here. We'll see how it goes. Yeah, it looks a little more favorable. Some other key cases in the International Court of Justice and their history. One of the biggest ones was not long after the International Court of Justice was created, and that is what's known as the Corfu Channel case. And it's the British versus the Albanians, which sounds like a soccer match also. If you've ever seen the beginning of the movie, the James Bond movie For Your Eyes Only, you'll see how what you'll see is that there's a British ship which is sunk, and it strikes a mine, and a valuable piece of nuclear technology is lost, and James Bond and all the others have to go try and retrieve this before the Russians get it. But that's actually based on a real life case where a British ship struck a mine left over from World War II, just like in the movie. And in this case, Albania just left some of these mines around, and they didn't really clear them away. So what happened was, when a British ship struck it, it did some damage. Not sure if I think there were some sailors who were killed too. And so Britain demanded compensation. Albania was a communist regime at the time, and they refused to pay for the damage that they did. And this went on for many years. And eventually, I'm not sure if Albania ever paid. So people would say, well, the court didn't accomplish its task. At the same time, Albania was pretty much seen as an international pariah. Like, I can't believe you didn't pay that, what you owed. And so it would have been just better off for the Albanians to pay. Instead, by defying the International Court of Justice, um, they got no favors for doing that. So, that in some ways it's like a loss for the the International Court of Justice. But most people began to say that, come on, you should have been getting rid of these mines left over from World War II. It's your fault. And it took a long time for Albania to recover any prestige because of this action. So, anyway, whew. The other case, also, believe it or not, involves mining, and that is Nicaragua versus the U.S. in the 1980s. And what happened was that well, have you ever seen the movie American Made? Well, what happened was um, in the movie, you'll know that the U.S. was trying to overthrow the Nicaraguan regime. And in this movie, or in real life also, in addition to running guns to Nicaraguan rebels, we also supported groups, and our CIA would actually try to mine the harbors of Managua, which was the capital of Nicaragua. And some of them struck, ships struck mines. It's not like thousands of people died or anything, but it looked really bad. And so Nicaragua took the U.S. to court for mining their harbor. And what happened is the International Court of Justice ruled overwhelmingly that the U.S. was at fault, that we should stop doing it. And the Reagan administration, not really big fans of the UN, loudly issued condemnations of the ruling, talking about how Nicaragua was, which is true, trying to overthrow their neighbors like Costa Rica, El Salvador, Honduras, that the U.S. was justified in trying to stop the Nicaraguan regime. Well, so the ruling went against us, and we openly said we would not abide by the ruling. However, the mining of the harbors in Managua also stopped. So you could say that, the International Court of Justice ruling also curtailed the U.S. actions against the capital of Managua. Now, later, the Sandinistas ran in an election, one that had international observers, and they felt confident they were going to win. But the leader of the Sandinistas, the Marxist regime, Daniel Ortega, lost to the widow of the former editor of the major newspaper La Prensa. And she herself took over when her husband was murdered by the previous dictator, but that the communists overthrew. However, the Marxist government also tried to shut her down and cause her trouble, and she stood up to them. And because she stood up to them in a big shocking election, the Violeta Chamorro won, and then issues in Nicaragua started to die down. Although I'm told Ortega won the presidency recently again as sort of a populist leader. Let's move on to, again, an increased number of countries recognize the right of the International Court of Justice to have compulsory jurisdiction to rule on cases. They've resolved disputes in Latin America and the Middle East as well. And world opinion is influenced also by their advisory role that they've played. There's a link down there which shows you all of the cases that have been resolved, that are still pending. But others claim that the International Court of Justice has not been near as effective, that states remain more powerful than this international court. This is cases where countries like Israel do not accept the right of the International Court of Justice to rule. There were a few cases like the ones I mentioned to you involving mining, U.S. versus Nicaragua and Albania, where the rulings were flouted, meaning they were not followed. And there is no enforcement mechanism. In the case of Albania, there was no mechanism that could force Albania to pay. Now, some believe that the International Court of Justice could be better if, when they issued their ruling, it is incumbent upon the Security Council or General Assembly to issue sanctions on Albania. And in fact, sanctions that would be much more than these countries would be willing to pay. Of course, we'd like to have this happen in Albania because their Marxist regime in 1946, yeah, we would have loved to make them pay. But I'm sure the U.S. would hate to pay damages for what we did in Nicaragua, trying to overthrow the Marxist government there. Now, there's another international court I thought I'd tell you about, and that is the International Criminal Court. This goes back to World War II. Remember, only states can be party before the International Court of Justice. So where was the justice going to be internationally for all those who abused human rights during World War II? Well, if you remember what happened, you had what's known as the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi Germany, not Nazi Germany, but representatives of the Nazi Germany government, which ceased to exist by that time, by the time of the trials, they were put on trial for war crimes abuses. And the same thing happened in Tokyo, where they were called the Tokyo tribunals, where Japanese military leaders and civilian leaders who were in charge of the government put the regime on trial. And so what happened was, these were called ad hoc tribunals because they hadn't been set up beforehand. I know there was a lot of planning on the UN during the war effort, but nobody thought about what they were going to do to prosecute human rights abuses. There were some terrible ones, of course, probably worse than we thought. Sorry, there was a bee there. And so what happened was these ad hoc tribunals were sort of like put together just for that case, ad hoc, kind of put together at the last minute. And while most of those trials were done fairly, a couple of people were executed for them, but many people kind of got off without facing too much in the way of punishment, and some people were never caught. So there was, for years, people talked about, well, we ought to have like a permanent court with more rules, something where human rights abuses can be prosecuted. But, you had the Cold War going on, memory of what the Nazi Germany regime did and Hideki Tojo's government in Japan did. People thought, okay, we solved these two cases. We won't see these kinds of abuses again. There's no need for a permanent court or established court on International Criminal Court where individuals are held liable for their actions. The state versus state thing can work. Plus, you had some Cold War politics coming in. Nobody was prosecuted for the massacre of Hungarians. U.S. forces did not face international prosecution for our actions in Vietnam, although they faced domestic prosecutions, I might add. But after the Cold War, you saw a series of terrible massacres going on in Somalia, but also especially in Bosnia and Rwanda. And this you started having courts come together to solve these. There was a court, I got to visit the courts in Rwanda. They're in the Tanzanian town of Arusha. And the UN helped administer these, but at the same time, again, they were ad hoc courts. There were special courts just for Rwanda. And there were other court cases that were in the Netherlands, I believe. And those were just for what happened in Bosnia. And what I think people were concerned about is, okay, we obviously need a more permanent court with more established rules because these massacres are starting to come back, the same that we hadn't seen since World War II. And so what happened was a number of countries got together and they negotiated. They negotiated having these international criminal tribunals tried to create a more permanent international criminal court where individuals would be held liable. And these this came forth in a 1997, I believe it was 1997 treaty called the Rome Treaty, where a number of different countries signed this treaty establishing an international criminal court. If you take a look at the slides on page 15, slide 16, we're on 15 now, you'll see which countries signed the International Criminal Court and which countries did not. There we go. Sorry, I'm just making up a couple burgers here. So take a look over the graph and take a look. The ones in green are the ones who signed the International Criminal Court. See? And the others are the ones who, the ones in gray are the ones that did not sign those treaties. Got to have a little Worcestershire on those. So also, as you can see, I mean, there are a fair number of countries that signed the Rome Treaty, enough to have it come into force. Now, just like the amendment procedure in the United States, not every state has to approve an amendment before it becomes law. In this case, they needed a number of different countries to ratify it. Once enough countries had ratified it, it would come into existence whether every country signed it or not. So you can see in North America, Canada and Mexico, it looks like Honduras, all signed the International Criminal Court. It looks like just about every country except for one in South America signed it. A number of Latin American countries signed it. Just about everybody in Europe signed it, except for, at the time, the Czech Republic, Australia, New Zealand. Where do you not see many countries signing it? Trying to see who that is. Well, certainly you can see, if you can find the U.S. on the map, you can find that we did not sign such a court. The U.S. What happened was Bill Clinton, at the end of his second term in office, he signed the International Criminal Court Treaty, as he put it, with reservations, because we wanted some protections for our U.S. troops, who often have to do the mission of others to protect other countries. But if you read the Rome Treaty, it does not supersede a country's legal system. It only provides a remedy if the domestic court will do nothing about a particular case. Ugh, excuse me. And so, like if you had the case of Vietnam, you could say, well, U.S. troops would have been prosecuted for some of their war crimes. Like the worst of the massacres is a place called My Lai. But the U.S. military court did prosecute the people responsible for the massacre. In fact, it was a guy from Georgia was one of the ones who was prosecuted. And his name was William Calley. He was one of the leaders of the massacre. He was a Georgian. And a guest speaker in our class was someone who was involved in the case, the My Lai massacre case. And it was eventually sent to, it went part of military court, and Lieutenant Calley spent some time in prison, in fact, for the massacre. He was fed up because a lot of his troops were dying. And they were unable to stop the enemy from doing things to him. They never even saw the enemy in some cases. They were being ambushed. And so Lieutenant Calley and his men decided to take it out on those who were in a nearby village of My Lai, thinking they were really responsible, which sadly turned out not to be the case. All right. So we'll stop there. And we'll pick up next time. Um, we'll pick up next time with other UN organizations. By then, the burgers may be done.